On the September 9th, 1991 edition of Primetime Wrestling, Bobby Heenan would introduce a major signing to WWE. He wasn't just a world champion. According to Heenan, he was the real world's champion. Outwalked the Nature Boy Ric Flair, while Bobby Heenan held on to the WCW International Heavyweight title as it was known at the time, also known colloquially as the Big Gold Belt. But how did a major WCW title end up on WWE programming? The short answer is a man who was serving as EVP of WCW at the time, Jim Herd. I'll get to more about Jim and Rick's history a bit later. What most know about Jim's career pre-WCW is that he was at one time a manager at Pizza Hut, but he also had experience in the television industry, being a former production executive for KPLR TV in St. Louis. This was the same channel that aired Wrestling at the Chase, which ran on the channel for 24 years, though it's not clear if Herd had anything to do with that product. Likely due to this experience, and also a connection to a Turner executive, Herd was hired by Turner Broadcasting and placed in charge of WCW in January of 1989. Chances are, if you've heard of Jim, you've mostly heard bad stories about him. He's not exactly the most popular executive amongst wrestlers who work for him, and for a few very good reasons. His lasting reputation is that he seemed to have not a lot of product knowledge, and didn't seem willing to learn any, but still wanted to contribute ideas. He was credited with such ideas as a tag team of wrestling hunchbacks, who could never be pinned as both of their shoulders were never on the mat together. Herd apparently thought that this would make the team unbeatable, until it had to be explained to him that there are in fact other ways to win a wrestling match. This is perhaps indicative of the level of wrestling knowledge we're dealing with here. That idea was quickly rejected by the booking committee, who knew much better, but occasionally one of Herd's daft ideas would make it to the ring. Introducing the Ding Dongs, played by Greg Evans and Richard Sartain, who had previously worked as the Rockin' Rebels. The team would come running out wearing awful orange costumes, thankfully with masks so they couldn't be identified, billed from Belleville, USA, of which there actually is one in Illinois. To make things worse, they would be wearing bells on their wrists and ankles that could be heard every time they moved, and they would have a bell in the corner that they would ring to fire themselves up. As you can imagine, this annoyed audiences fairly quickly. To be fair to them, neither Evans or Sartain looked to be bad wrestlers in the slightest, but the gimmick wouldn't ring in much success. As best I can tell, Jim Herd's reason for this ridiculous gimmick is he was trying to come up with wacky characters that kids would love, because that's what he saw WWE doing at the time, with acts like the Bushwhackers. Unfortunately though, Herd seemed to be taking the wrong lessons from how WWE gained its national audience, as the sillier gimmicks didn't last long there either. One unfortunate wrestler who personified not one, but two of Herd's bad ideas was Brad Armstrong, brother of Brian Armstrong, better known as the Road Dogg. In September 1990, Brad would be repackaged as the Candyman, wearing candy-coloured tights and throwing sweets out to the crowd on his way to the ring. Years later, Herd claimed that the reasoning behind this gimmick was not just to appeal to children, but also to try and get a brand deal with Hershey, which fell through. Later on, near the end of Herd's time in WCW, Brad would be given a new costume to wear. A new, suspiciously familiar costume, recoloured to match the WCW logo at the time. Yes, Brad would be bitten by a radioactive shitty idea and would become known as Arachnaman, complete with silly strings shooting from his hands. Maybe a young Serpentico might have seen this, who would have been 7 years old at the time by my reckoning. As you might well imagine, Marvel Comics' super legal team got involved fairly quickly, and the Arachnaman gimmick was squashed. If you're going to infringe on Marvel's trademarks, you might as well present it well, like when the AWA's Terry Boulder became the Incredible Hulk Hogan, brother. They billed Arachnaman from Web City, not even New York. Speaking of brand deals, Jim was also responsible for another infamous brand deal with a sneaker brand called Ruse, now known as Kangaroos. I genuinely never heard of these before making this video, and I don't know how I feel about shoes with pockets, but that's neither here nor there. According to Jim Cornette, in one of his dozens of shoot interviews where he talks about Herd, Jim Herd arranged for the WCW wrestlers to work their matches wearing roos, which were intended to be athletic wear, but the wrestlers hated these shoes, so the edict was quickly removed. There are also numerous adverts that are still with us through the magic of YouTube that feature various WCW stars promoting the sneakers with the tagline, "Shoes for your feet, pockets for your stuff." That very much sounds like it came from an SNL sketch. I can even hear it being said by Phil Hartman or Don Pardo. Now I can't talk about Jim Herd's creative input without bringing up one of the craziest ideas that's been attributed to him. It seems like he and one Ric Flair just never really got along. And it also seemed like Herd didn't much care for sticking with established gimmicks that had worked for years, like Flair had at the time. It's been claimed for many years by Ric himself that Jim once pitched an idea for Ric Flair to trade his suave suits and long blonde locks and become a Roman gladiator, now going by the name Spartacus. Clearly, this was never going to actually happen. And in a 2020 interview with Conrad Thompson, Herd would deny that this was ever seriously pitched. His defense would be that many silly ideas would be thrown into meetings, but were mainly tongue-in-cheek and not meant to be serious suggestions. Or that's what he implied at least. Jim also noted that the idea came from Turner buying a backlog of black and white movies and colorizing them, and it was felt that there needed to be a cross-promotion with these movies. And this may well be where the Spartacus idea came from. There is some weight to this, given Tony Schiavone's explanation of RoboCop being in WCW later on, which is that there was pressure from Turner to co-promote with the release of RoboCop 2. As I mentioned earlier, Jim wasn't much popular with many wrestlers, and if the stories are true, he didn't really do much to change that. One such wrestler that hated Herd is a man who's known to hold a grudge or two, the franchise Shane Douglas. In a 2018 shoot interview, Shane told a story about once meeting Herd at his Atlanta office. Shane claimed that Jim talked down to him the entire time, and at one point handed him a document while saying, "You probably won't understand this, just being a wrestler and all." Shane, with his 2 master's degrees in education, wasn't thrilled by this comment, and claims to not only have understood the document, which included ratings information for various other wrestling shows, but he understood it better than Herd. Another of Herd's more famous enemies was Jim Cornette, who, as you can probably imagine, has talked endlessly about Herd over the years. In fact, he's done 2 entire shoot interviews about the period of his career that he worked for Herd. I recommend in particular his Timeline 1989 and 1990 interviews by Kayfabe Commentaries. If I went through Cornette's grievances with Jim Herd, we'd be here all day. And Jim tells it all way better himself, but I'll just share this one story. Having left WCW in October 1990, 1 year before Herd would leave, Jim, upon hearing about how bad WCW's business had gotten, would be inspired to send Jim Herd a funeral wreath of black roses, with a card that read, "My deepest sympathies for the death of your wrestling promotion." According to Cornette, Herd was fuming when he received the wreath and placed it on the desk of Jim Ross, who worked in the WCW offices at the time. Sorry for teasing you at the start, but now we'll get to Herd's biggest blunder of all, managing to get the WCW World Championship into the hands of the competition. Flair and Herd's feud resulted mainly from Ric Flair being the WCW booker at the time, and Herd constantly wanting to get involved and change things. In 1991, Ric would finally have enough to the point of quitting the company, while he was the International Champion as the belt was then called. In Jim Cornette's Timeline 1990 interview with Kayfabe Commentaries, Jim actually shows a copy of the actual resignation letter that Flair sent. Back in those days, in order to be the NWA World Champion, which is what the international title upheld the lineage of, the new champion was required to pay a deposit of $25,000, which will be repaid back to the champion upon losing the belt. When Ric left WCW, he claimed that for whatever reason the deposit wasn't returned to him, and so he kept possession of the belt. When Ric arrived in WWE in September 91, he considered the belt his, and in a way of sticking it to Jim Herd, he made the primetime appearance with the belt, claiming to be the real world's champion. Much like with Marvel and Arachnoman earlier, WCW and Turner's legal team got involved pretty quickly. Going forward, WWE would not be allowed to show the belt. So they would have Flair come out with a modified tag team title belt, and they would blur it out in the edit to make it look like Flair was still using the WCW belt. Ric Flair has claimed that he agreed to send the belt back once WCW paid him the deposit, but Jim Herd was refusing. However, not long after this incident, in January '92, Jim Herd would resign from Turner Broadcasting, and Ric Flair would return a month later. Upon his return, Ric claimed in a 2004 interview with WWE that he was paid the deposit plus interest. In all my years of listening to and reading interviews with wrestlers, I don't remember ever hearing a good thing said about Jim Herd. He was clearly a capable businessman to have reached such a high corporate level, but clearly didn't understand enough about the wrestling business, and yet tried to change it anyway. As I mentioned earlier, at the age of 88 years old, Jim Herd gave his first interview in decades to Conrad Thompson on his ad-free shows platform. I won't share too much from that interview, given that it's behind a paywall, but Herd claims that his biggest achievements that he brought to WCW were improvements to the visual presentation of the shows, such as better entrance sets, pyro and ramps. In the end, Jim Herd is one of those people that history doesn't remember kindly, but it's worth noting that he was the first in a line of WCW EVPs who failed to turn the company's fortunes. On Herd's watch came the classic Flair Steamboat trilogy, the ascension of Sting, and many more legendary talents, and yet WCW was still struggling. One thing you can't deny though, is that Jim was an influential figure in pro wrestling going into the 90s. One who now in his 90s is still talked about today. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.